Hi, my name is Kate Stuber, and my thesis was titled Peak Relational Training System for Individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorder, a correlational study in comparison to the ABLES-R and TOLD-I-4 linguistics assessments. Throughout the past several decades, the number of individuals that have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, has grown significantly. Prevalence rates are as high as 60 individuals diagnosed with ASD out of 10,000. Due to the increased prevalence, a need for effective interventions has also increased. Given the language deficits associated with ASD, there is a specific need for validated assessment tools that will provide meaningful targets for language training procedures, as well as controlled evaluations of the effectiveness of such procedures when they are based on established assessments. Two divergent perspectives have emerged over the past century regarding the causal elements underlying the development of language, with obvious implications for the assessment and treatment of ASD symptoms. The linguistic approach is concerned with the structural characteristics of language, for example, grammar and syntax, whereas the behavior analytic approach is concerned with the functional development of language as operant classes of verbal behaviors, such as tax and mands. The need for an assessment that accounts for the factors discussed in these contemporary theories is likely to correspond with the results obtained from linguistic as well as the traditional behavioral accounts of language development, and may therefore provide better targets for language instruction than either of these theories in isolation. A variety of systematically designed systems originated from Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior and have been established to evaluate the skill repertoires and deficits in individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities. A traditional behavior analytic approach that is widely used is the assessment of basic language and learning skills revised, also known as the ABLES-R. The ABLES-R is used to identify an individual's current skill repertoire and can be utilized as a tracking tool for skill development over a time period. As a contemporary extension of Skinner's 1957 verbal behavior, PEAK has emerged as an assessment tool and curriculum package designed to assess and improve language and cognitive skills for individuals with developmental disabilities. Finally, a linguistic approach to language development is the Test of Language Development Intermediate 4th Edition, also known as the TOLD-I-4, which is used as a linguistics tool throughout multiple human service fields. TOLD-I-4 was one of the first tests to focus solely on linguistic development. The purpose of this study was to provide the first analysis of how individuals' abilities to derive relations were related to their structural and functional language development proposed in linguistic and behavioral accounts of language. Development in these three theoretical areas were evaluated using assessments that are commonly used in application with individuals with autism and related disabilities. To evaluate traditional behavior analytic functional language development, the ABLES-R assessment was used. To evaluate linguistic structural development, the TOLD-I-4 was used. Finally, to evaluate derived relational abilities, the PEAK-EPA was used. The present study therefore extends upon a growing body of research supporting the psychometric development of language assessments for individuals with autism by evaluating the convergent validity of three commonly used assessments applied with this population. A total of 30 participants, 18 male and 12 female, ranging in age from 3 to 23 years old, were involved in the present study. All participants in the current study had a diagnosis of autism or had both a diagnosis of autism and an additional comorbid diagnosis. Assessments were completed in the participant's home or in a clinical setting to minimize distractions. Regardless of the location, sessions always took place at a table, which had only the materials for each assessment and a writing utensil. The participant and the assessor sat in chairs directly across from one another. For the purposes of this study, all other stimuli were placed outside the session room to ensure that all focus was on the assessment. The assessor provided the necessary stimuli for conducting each assessment. The PEAK pre-assessment focuses on all four relations: reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity, and equivalence, each of which has 2 programs per skill difficulty. The PEAK pre-assessment will consist of a total of 24 programs and will take approximately 1 hour to conduct. To begin the assessment, the assessor has all pre-assessment stimuli found in the back of the equivalence book cut out and ready for presentation throughout the administration of the assessment. Any other stimuli that may be needed, such as food or sandpaper, will need to be provided by the assessor. It is suggested that the assessor reads through the assessment before beginning with the participant to ensure that all materials that are needed will be available. During the implementation of the assessment, the assessor states a script verbatim in which participants are asked to look at arbitrary stimuli. The arbitrary stimuli are trained and tested through match-to-sample or sequential presentation. In a match-to-sample arrangement, a sample stimulus is presented, for example, A1, along with 2 comparison stimuli, B1 and B2. The assessor points to the sample stimulus A1 and states, "This is the same as this," while pointing to the comparison stimuli. Next, one of the previously used comparison stimuli are presented as a sample stimulus, B1, with 2 comparison stimuli, A1 and A2. The assessor says, "Find the same," while pointing to the sample stimulus, B1. A response involving the participant pointing to the correct comparison stimulus that corresponds with the sample stimulus would be marked as correct. In a sequential presentation, a sample stimulus, A1, is followed sequentially by a comparison stimulus, B1, and provides a vocal stimulus stating whether or not the sample stimulus is the same as the comparison stimulus. For example, those were the same, or those were not the same. The sample stimulus was presented again, A1, followed sequentially by a different comparison stimulus, B2, and states a vocal stimulus to indicate whether the sample stimulus is the same as the comparison stimulus. For example, those were not the same. Lastly, the assessor presents the prior comparison stimuli, A1 and B1, and asks, were those the same? A correct answer would indicate yes if the corresponding stimulus was presented, or no if an unrelated stimulus was presented. A display of these arbitrary stimuli can be found to the right in Figure 7. The pre-assessment consists of 2 tests. There are 3 levels of difficulty for each type of relation, and the maximum score that can be achieved for each type of relation is 12. There is a total possible score of 48 points for the entire pre-assessment. This study will be using the long version of the pre-assessment, which means that both tests will be run for each program. The assessor starts with Reflexivity Basic Program 1 on page 82 as the first program. Programs must be run in successive order. If the participant scores a 0 for 5 consecutive tests, the assessor is to stop the assessment. The ABLES-R reviews 544 skills from 25 different skill areas. This assessment includes a wide range of skills varying from simpler to more complex tasks, with the goal of refining the level of examination of an individual's skill set with language and learning. Items were first assessed indirectly by the participants acting BCBA. During the completion of the assessment, any items that were marked as unknown were directly assessed by the researcher to ensure that the participants' scores were a direct reflection of their ability to complete each item. Each subcategory varies in length, anywhere from 6 to 57 tasks. For each task, the researcher goes through following the task objective and utilizes the question as assistance. Depending on the participant's response, the researcher then looks at the criteria and scores the task appropriately. At the back of the ABLES-R protocol book, there is a list of tools to assist in the completion of tasks. This can be found in the appendix on page 94 of the ABLES-R protocol book. These appendices provide a guide of examples for 15 of the tasks. For example, task A1 is taking a reinforcer when offered. The researcher starts out by holding a reinforcer and offering it to the participant, such as holding out an M&M. When the reinforcer is available to the participant, will the participant take the reinforcement? If the participant takes the reinforcer within 3 seconds all of the time, the score is a 2. If the participant takes the reinforcer either not all of the time or takes more than 3 seconds to respond, the score is a 1. If the participant does not take the reinforcer or has no reaction, the score is a 0. The assessor then begins at task A1 and continues through the assessment following each task in order that is on the protocol forms. Each task is rated on a scale of 0 to 1, 0 to 2, or 0 to 4. The criteria that must be met for scoring purposes is always displayed under the criteria column in the protocol forms. The assessor needs to keep in mind that the criteria is not the same for each task, so criteria must be referenced each time a task is scored. The TOLD-I-4 is an assessment that is most commonly used by speech-language pathologists in diagnosing language disorders. There are 6 subtests to the assessment. Subtest 1, an example would be the speaker saying, "The boys are fun, the boys are energetic." The participant would then be expected to respond, "The boys are fun and energetic." Through this exercise, the participant is demonstrating their ability to form compound or complex sentences. For subtest 2, an example would be, when asked, "Point to the picture that goes best with tail wagger." The participant would be expected to point to the picture of the cat. For subtest 3, the participant could be told the 3 following words: home, go, let's, and from this would respond, "Let's go home." For subtest 4, when presented with the 3 words dog, horse, cat, the participant would demonstrate the competency through responding that all of those words are animals. The 5th subtest, morphological comprehension, participants are given different sentences and distinguishing whether they are correct or incorrect sentences. For the final subtests, individuals are given different words, such as the word cent. It can have multiple different meanings. Although it is pronounced the same way, but it is spelled different, participants can respond that it means smallest unit of money, a penny, mailed, dispatched, odor or smell, power of detection, etc. The administration of the TOLD-I-4 takes approximately 35 to 50 minutes, depending on the participant's ability to complete subtests. Throughout the administration process, if a participant misses a variety of consecutive answers, which varies per subtest, the researcher is asked to move on to the next subtest. During the administration of the assessment, the assessor needs to read all subtest instructions and be careful prior to completing the assessment. Scoring on each subtest is different, and the discontinuation of testing after consecutive failures differs as well. To analyze the results of each assessment, data was evaluated by first finding the percentage correct. The amount of total points received was divided by the total amount of points and then multiplied by 100 to yield a percentage. The assessment mean scores and standard deviations for each assessment were as followed. Peak EPA mean was 42.47 with a standard deviation of 28.10. TOLD I4 mean was 39.5 with a standard deviation of 32.58. And the ABLES-R mean was 64.3 with a standard deviation of 22.46. In order to evaluate the relationship between peak EPA, the TOLD I4, and the ABLES-R, a Pearson correlation test was run on the assessment scores derived from the above study. The assessment scores on all three assessments are shown as raw scores from each assessment. A graph summarizing the relationship between the peak EPA, TOLD I4, and the ABLES-R are shown in Figure 3. Upon visual analysis of Figure 3, trends can be identified as one score goes down, the remaining two assessment scores tend to follow. Although there are variations, this can be generally said about the overall data. An evaluation on the relationship between the peak EPA and the TOLD I4 was completed using a Pearson correlation test. The peak EPA total score ranged from a minimum of 0 to a maximum of 48. A graph summarizing the relationship between the peak EPA and the TOLD I4 is displayed in Figure 4. The results of the Pearson correlation test that there was a very strong significant correlation between the two assessments, and that total scores on the peak EPA are a very strong predictor of the total scores on the TOLD I4 assessment, with an R-squared value of 0.86. The R-squared value suggests that just over 86% of the variance in the peak EPA assessment can be accounted for by participants' results on the TOLD I4. In order to compare assessment, raw scores were divided by the total score and multiplied by 100%. Percentages derived from this calculation were then compared in order to evaluate the relationship of the two assessments. Similar to the analysis of the peak EPA to the TOLD I4 scores, the peak EPA scores were evaluated to determine their relationship with the ABLES-R assessment. A graph summarizing the relationship between the peak EPA and the ABLES-R is displayed in Figure 5. Although not quite as strong as the correlation between the previous correlation, the results of the Pearson correlation suggest that there is a strong and significant correlation between the peak EPA and the ABLES-R assessments. This relationship also suggests that the total scores received on the peak EPA are a strong predictor of the total scores on the ABLES-R assessment, with an R-square value of 0.42. A final evaluation between the TOLD I4 and the ABLES-R was completed in order to determine the relationship between the two assessments. A graph summarizing the relationship between the TOLD I4 assessment and the ABLES-R is displayed in Figure 6. The results of the Pearson correlation suggest that there is a moderate correlation between the two assessments. This relationship also suggests that the total scores received on the TOLD I4 assessment are a moderate predictor of the total scores on the ABLES-R assessment, with an R-squared value of 0.21. A visual analysis of all correlations was completed, displaying the highest correlation in the peak EPA to TOLD I4 assessments. A very strong correlation was found to be true when comparing the peak EPA to TOLD I4, suggesting that contemporary behavioral language theories may provide a strong account for the development of linguistic structure. The data gained from the TOLD I4 to ABLES correlation was not as strong. This weaker relationship may be the result of theoretical differences between the traditional behavioral accounts, from which the ABLES-R was developed, and linguistics accounts providing the basis for the TOLD I4 assessment, resulting in divergent scores on these assessments. Consequently, a probable reason for the weak correlation that is seen in the data for TOLD I4 to the ABLES-R relationship is due to a previous disconnect seen between the authors of these two assessments. A matrix presenting the Pearson correlations between the peak EPA to TOLD, peak EPA to ABLES-R, and TOLD to ABLES-R can be seen in Table 2. This display of correlations also shows the associated subtests for peak EPA: reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity, and equivalence. Limitations for the current study are as follows. Participants of the study consisted of 2 nonverbal participants, causing 5 of the 6 subtests for the TOLD to be very difficult due to their limited verbal repertoire. The TOLD I4 may not have been suitable for some participants. Some participants had an age range that would be suitable for the TELD or for the primary edition of TOLD. The small sample size was also a limitation. However, due to the sample size being relatively small, the data produced significant results, which suggests that the current study poses high internal validity due to increased statistical influence. Future research would be best if it were to look at utilizing multiple versions of the told and finding an assessment tool for nonverbal individuals that could be compared to the peak and to the ables.